Welcome to the China workshop. I'm Sam-Kee Cheng. I'm the coordinator of the China working group for a number of years. And we have been holding workshop every year since a few years ago before the conference, and now it's part of the conference. Last year, we did the discussion on the rise of China and its implications to the world. This year, our subject is why China is not imperialist. We are going to have 4 presentations on this subject by different speakers. And after all our presentations, we will have the Q&A session from the audience here and also anyone who's joining online as well. So you're all welcome to give your comments and feedback afterwards. I will give the first presentation on primitive socialist accumulation and common prosperity in China, and conclude with the implications to the developing country. I completed my PhD at SOAS on the subject of the political economy of China's development and China's going out. You can see my work on the Review of Radical Political Economics, Journal of Contemporary Asia, and monthly review essays. I'm now research assistant professor at the University of Macau, and am currently working on a book on primitive socialist accumulation in China. Michael Roberts is our second speaker. He's a well-known Marxist economist and independent researcher. He publishes regularly on his blog, which is followed by many. He's the author of several books: The Great Recession, The Long Depression, World in Crisis, March 200, Engels 200, Capitalism in the 21st Century, and a forthcoming book, The World in the 2020s and Beyond. His presentation title today is Imperialism According to Lenin, the Export of Capital and the Case of China. Dic Lo is our third speaker. His title of presentation is A Critique of Western-centric Discourses on China and Imperialism. Dic Lo is currently professor of political economy at Lingnan College, Sun Yat-sen University. He has been with the School of Oriental and African Studies of University of London since 1994, from which he is on sabbatical leave in 2024 and 2025. Dic Lo is also my supervisor for my PhD. He is a political economist with research specialization in China and world development. He has published research articles both in English and Chinese in academic journals, including the Cambridge Journal of Economics, China Quarterly Journal of Economics Issues, Review of Radical Political Economics, the World Quarterly, and other Chinese journals as well. Michael Dunford is our last speaker. His presentation title is Colonialism and Imperialism versus a Community of Common Destiny for Humankind, Balance and Hegemony versus Harmony. Michael is Emeritus Professor of School of Global Studies in University of Sussex, Affiliated Scholar, Institute of Geographical Sciences and Natural Resources Research in the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He is based in Beijing. Most recently, he has completed a book on revisiting uneven development and is to be published by Elgar in 2026. So after this introduction, we have 15 minutes for each presentation. I will now begin, and afterwards you can give your questions and feedback. So let me share my PowerPoint here. Yes, my title is quite long and it's quite impossible to finish it in just 15 minutes. So my focus will be mostly on primitive socialist accumulation, and with some findings of implications to the developing world and what's common prosperities in China at the moment. Social revolutions in regions of related developments have always been called into question if their overthrow of landlord bourgeois rule can be deemed as truly socialist due to the preponderance of the peasantry and the weakness of the proletariat, which were themselves symptoms of an underdeveloped capitalism brought to these places by the imperialist powers. In his preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx said, new superior relations of production never replace older ones before material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. Can this be taken to mean that the establishment of workers' rule in underdeveloped regions is against Marx, or otherwise premature, maybe because more fundamentally, how can accumulation geared towards social needs instead of profit be sustained in a world dominated by capitalist imperialism? As we know, history did not unfold as Marx and Engels expected. The revolution did not start in the West, the most industrialized countries. There is a famous passage from the Communist Manifesto that says the bourgeoisie will replicate its social order to the whole world. When the October Revolution happened, many Marxists questioned its legitimacy. Most famously, the so-called Pope of Marxism, Karl Kautsky, has said this about the Russian working class taking power. The dictatorship of the proletariat means the inhibition of capitalist production. The capitalist mode of production becomes an impossibility under a proletarian regime. Is Russia already equipped to put in place a socialist mode of production? Besides, the Russian working class is neither sufficiently strong nor sufficiently developed. This appears to be based on the popular interpretation of Marx that I referred to earlier. But for Lenin, this is one of the best-known responses that he gave on this issue. He said, while the development of world history as a whole follows general laws, it is by no means precluded, but on the contrary, presumed that certain periods of development may display peculiarities in either the form or the sequence of these developments. If a definite level of culture is required for the building of socialism, although nobody can just say what that definite level of culture is, for it differs in every Western European country, why cannot we begin by first achieving the prerequisites for that definite level of culture in a revolutionary way, and then with the aid of the workers' and peasants' government and Soviet system, proceed to overtake the other nations, that is, in Lenin's revolutions. So let's go back to what Marx and Engels may have said on this problem. Marx and Engels always considered historical materialism as a guide to revolutionary practice to changing the world. There is no teleology in Marxism. So things won't happen automatically because of economic development. There may be no economic development at all when the conditions did not exist. For example, we have seen the two world wars that happened. Economic development did not really lead to progressive social development. It could lead to destruction. This is one of the most famous passages where Marx and Engels stated the program of revolution in relation to productive forces on a world scale. It is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less propertied classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and until the association of the proletarians has progressed sufficiently far not only in one country, but in all the leading countries of the world. That competition between the proletarians of these countries ceases, and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated in the hands of the workers. Our concern cannot simply be to modify private property, but to abolish it, not to hush up class antagonisms, but to abolish classes, not to improve the existing society, but to found a new one. So this is a rough sketch of the context of the world that we are seeing today, combined and uneven development. Imperialism, that is a systematic transfer of value from the colonial regions to the imperial centers, create uneven and combined development on a world scale. The colonial regions are frozen in various stages of pre-capitalist development, where the rulers, typically big landlords, took on the role of the bourgeoisie as agents of world imperialism. But they are also dependent on the imperialists for capital, technology, access to market, etc. So their interest and entire existence is bound with the world imperialist system. So in these countries, as the latecomers in development objectively have the privilege of historic backwardness. The ability to achieve national independence and development depends on whether they could overcome the constraints imposed by the bourgeoisie. So the historic task of removing foreign domination and landlord capitalist rule become one and fell on the shoulders of the proletariat in alliance with the peasant masses. So in the case of China, long story short, since the Opium War, China has had a republican revolution that established a formal liberal capitalist constitution. However, there was no change in the basic social order. The old ruling class is still in power, but the country was split along the imperialist spheres of influence and fell into constant warfare, as you can see in this poster that's indicating different imperial powers were occupying or having concessions in different parts of China. So radical nationalist intellectuals debated ferociously over ways of saving China. Things came to a head in 1919 when the Paris Peace Conference decided to transfer German colonies in China to Japan, leading to widespread disillusionment with Western liberalism and the beginning of an anti-imperialist national movement. That's called the May 4th movement in 1919. The left wing of the radical intelligentsia founded the Communist Party of China in 1921. It became a section of the Communist International. The Comintern decided that the immediate task for the Chinese Revolution is to end feudalism and imperialist domination. The Comintern determined that the national bourgeoisie should lead this process and the Communist Party should mobilize working people to support this. However, this program was fundamentally flawed, as the Chinese bourgeoisie were closely linked to landlordism and imperialism and hated the growth of the Communist Party. So this collaboration was on a false basis, didn't last long. Both the right wing and the left wing of the nationalists purged and massacred communists at the height of the mass movement in 1927. The communists were driven to the countryside and started to build a separate state along Soviet lines. After 22 years of struggle, the nationalists were expelled from the mainland and the People's Republic was established. This is what Mao said at the end of the Second World War on why Chinese bourgeoisie could not carry out agrarian reform. That is actually in their own program, agrarian reform, but they could not carry it out. He then went on to say that where the capital for industrial development would come from, internal accumulation and foreign investments. Never really said that it can just be relying on China's own internal accumulation alone. So Mao laid the emphasis on the fact that agrarian reforms would form the basis of large-scale industrialization and he expected foreign investments to be crucial. But as we all know, things did not turn out as Mao expected. The Republic expropriated the bourgeoisie in the proletarian regime and began the 5-year plan in 1950s. As a result of the Western sanctions against China brought by the Korean War. So rather than a foreign investment that Mao welcomed, it was the Soviet Union that helped build China industrial bases in what was referred to as one of the largest transfer of technology in history. So what are the tasks of the Communist Party after leading a successful proletarian revolution? To conquer state power and to develop. According to the CPC, a socialist economic system was built in 1956. By this, they mean that the state-owned and collectivized property had become the dominant in the entire economy. With the beginning of the 5-year plans, this would form the start of what Preobrazhensky would have called primitive socialist accumulation. The proletarian regime displaces the bourgeoisie and goes further. So the consolidation and growth of the state-owned industries, the public sector as a whole, requires resources from the world economy. Expropriation of the bourgeoisie from the domestic commanding height, internal accumulation heightens the need for external connections. Atomized capitalists, that is, those that are stripped of independent political agency, operate within a market established by state banks. Capitalist profits constrained and redirected by state planning towards social objectives. The law of value operates in conflict with the law of primitive socialist accumulation, which ultimately reflects the class struggle between bourgeois forces and the historic achievements of the revolution. As Preobrazhensky, the Soviet economist, explained, there is no longer capitalism, but it's not yet socialism. In a nutshell, there is constant competition between the state sector and the private sector in domestic and international markets. A workers' regime would need to consciously plan the development of state industries whilst getting a handle on the international market and the national class struggle, The primitive socialist accumulation means the proletarian regime's constant competition with the domestic and international capitalist sectors, which could only end with the displacement of the bourgeoisie on a world scale. As long as a workers' state remains isolated in the world market, there will be no fundamental shift to what would be a complete socialist mode of production. That is a production for human needs, not for value. So the contradiction between these two tendencies within the state economy does not take the form of antagonism between classes, but it exists nevertheless. The contradiction also fully characterizes the law of primitive accumulation itself, the law of primitive socialist accumulation itself, where distribution is concerned. So I'm not going to read the whole quote, but these slides, I'm going to upload it later on. So China is a transitional economy driven by two laws. And primitive social accumulation means that the proletarian regime's constant competition with domestic international capitalist sectors and can only end with displacement of the bourgeoisie on the world scale. And for the capitalists that is allowed to operate within this regime, they are constrained by the primitive social accumulation, and also this institutional setup underpinning the Communist Party's policy of utilization, restriction, and transformation of private capitalist enterprise. It has remained at the core of the PRC's economy. And the law of value operates in conflict with the law of primitive social accumulation, which we see there are a lot of contradictions in the Chinese economy. But this can is ultimately reflecting the class struggle between the bourgeois forces and the historic achievements of the revolutions. And this is the result that we have seen so far. China have emerged from the poorest country in the world, one of the poorest, to a middle income status in about 70 years. With the growth of capitalist development in China, there is growing socio-economic problems. But there is also a counter measures that is being put in place in restraining the growth of such inequality. That is how common prosperity was brought into light. This is what the Chinese government has called to establish a scientific public policy system and a reasonable redistribution system that benefits everyone with a focus on primary inclusive projects that facilitate people's well-being and guarantee their basic needs. So there is a set of long-range objectives in the 14th five-year plan for China, and the target is to basically achieve socialist modernization by 2035. And this is Ipsos Mori's Global Happiness Survey that's done in 2023. China has come up the top of the list with the highest happiness rate by far of the countries that sampled. And in different aspects that people were asked for, from personal to social to the national, generally China's have got from between 70 to 90 kind of rate of satisfaction. Is a sharp contrast to the other countries that you can see in this graph. If you're interested, you can go into the Ipsos Mori Global Happiness Survey and to find out the results. Now, there are many conclusions from this. Not going to be able to give you the full list, reading it out, but I think for the most important point here is that China has proven that socialist revolutions in regions of belated development are neither freak events nor departures from the Marxist program. And they are indispensable for social progress in industrial development, for a former colonized economy that want to be getting rid of the colonial legacies and to be able to catch up and pull ahead. So it's not only entirely dependent on how China develops with the rising productivity and the deeper trading relationships with the world market. Contradictions between the two systems will continue and sharpen. The struggle between the state economy and private capital cannot end until capitalism is replaced by socialism worldwide. So the other key point is that class politics outside China is as important as to how the Communist Party is constraining the capitalist logic at home. So for the rest of the world, especially developing countries, how to use Chinese investment to form strong sovereign and social development agendas that would strengthen the forces against neoliberalism and imperialism, this would be the task for the progressive popular forces in the developing countries. So hopefully the China example can provide some examples for those who want to form sovereign and social development agendas and provide some material basis as well in supporting the quest for this, right? Okay, thank you very much. I will pass it over. Thank you. Okay, I'll pass it over to Michael Roberts now.
Thank you, Sam. I'll just get my thing up if I can.
Yes.
I can find the right one. There we go. Is that clear to everybody?
Yes.
Yep. Well, the session's title is Why China is Not Imperialist, with the emphasis on the word not by the organizers. And I think there's a reason for that, because I think it's pretty clear that the vast majority, maybe that's a bit strong, a majority of Marxists, at least in the West, consider China capitalist and probably imperialist. I've been to several meetings of various groups, including the IIPPE before, where I've heard people state quite clearly it's self-evident that China is capitalist and imperialist. It's hardly worth discussing because it so clearly is. So I see that the China Working Group wants us to discuss this question a little bit more carefully and to see whether that's really the case. In this little presentation, I'm just going to concentrate on the economics of imperialism, the transfer of value and resources from the peripheral countries of the world to the imperialist core, and not on the political aspects, the military aspects of imperialism, which are not a subject, at least for my contribution. And I'm going to do that from the point of view of looking at what Lenin said was the basic constituents of imperialism back in 1915-16. And I've just boldly highlighted one of his 5 points, which is number 3, that the export of capital, as distinguished from the export of commodities, acquires exceptional importance. So here Lenin is saying their imperialism, or modern imperialism economically, isn't just the question of trade, export and import of commodities, although that is still important, but also the increasing export of capital and the returns on capital invested into the periphery by the imperialist core, which is the basis of the exploitation of an imperialist economy now of the periphery. And as it says at the bottom, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all the current territories of the globe amongst the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. So he's saying in 1915, imperialism is there. It's concentrated in a core of countries in what we now commonly call the global north. And the key characteristics of this imperialism from an economic point of view are the export of commodities, international trade, and the export of capital and the returns on that. So I'm going to provide, as far as I can, the latest information I can find on those subjects for us to make a judgment about whether China is imperialist or not. So in my view, there are probably 4 ways that we consider imperialist extraction based on the export of capital and trade. First of all, the transfer of value through international trade, unequal exchange, we call it in Marxist terms. I'll go into some figures about that without going into the theory of it too greatly. Then the flows of profit and interest and dividends which come back from the capital that's been invested by the imperialist core, the global north into the global south, and the flows of profit and interest and dividends that they get returning to the host country, the investing country as a result of that. And then actually looking at the size of foreign direct investment flows and stock. How much has been exported and who is exporting it in terms of direct investment, and how much stock of that capital has been built up, so that we can compare countries and see whether they fit the bill of being called imperialist or not. And finally, one very important one which has been developed more recently is to look at the stock of assets which countries have, net, that's after deducting the assets invested into their country, the net position, how much yield they're getting off, how much profit are they getting off in total from as a return on those investments in net foreign assets. And I think when we go down the figures, we'll be able to distinguish very clearly which are the imperialist countries and which are not. So let's look at international trade. There's been a transfer, a steady and substantial and persistent transfer of value through international trade between countries of the global north, which have higher technological composition, have powerful multinational companies, while the global south doesn't have the same level of technical composition. And yet, so the surplus value, the profit created in the peripheral countries of the global south, gets transferred through international trade, through the process of unequal exchange to the countries of the global north. This transfer of value is approximately, I mean, there are varying estimates. The views that Carcadi and I did in 2018 to come up with the figures based on using Marxist categories for production prices and so on, about 1% of GDP every year, annually, is transferred to the imperialist countries of the global north, and approximately the same from the dependent countries of the global south, not all the dependent countries, it'd be bigger than that figure. DC means dependent countries, if you like. So we've got this transfer of about 1% of GDP every year to the imperialist core. Now, considering that the imperialist core countries are growing at about 2% a year, you can see that this is not an unimportant figure in terms of establishing their prosperity or growth in the global north. Recently, the economist Thomas Rotter from Greenwich University has also looked at the value captured per employee by countries over the period of the last 30 years up to 2020. And you can clearly see on the left-hand graph here that that's the amount of value added captured in the process of exchange using input-output analysis. In the case of the US, it's something like way, way higher than any other country, and it's around about 1% per in $2,000 constant dollars. But if you look at China and other countries of the so-called global south, the BRICS, you can see that China has actually had an extraction or a transfer of value over this period of 1990 to 2025 of around about 0.5 percentage per in total amounts. And if you look at per employee, you get the same result. I've highlighted, these are the BRICS countries down the bottom, all the main BRICS countries as measured in the key here. And you can see that they're below the positive line, while all the well-known imperialist countries are well above the positive line in terms of value added captured per employee over the last 30 years or so, according to Ross's analysis. There is a clear division between the imperialists' extraction of value or transfer of value and the BRICS loss of value, including China, which is the red line on both sides you can see here. Now, even more up-to-date analysis is being done by Ishikara and Mokre. Their book is out shortly. They're using regional input-output tables, which you get from various sources, over 159 industries over a similar period to the Rotter one. And they found that there were huge international value transfers of about just under 6% of gross global production annually every year. With a total cumulative transfer of over 70 trillion euros during this period of 25 years. And the biggest net gainers, which you look on the right-hand side table here, that's the 5.9% every year. So this is an annual thing. You can see that Japan is getting 2.67, US just over 1. Nearly 1.1. All the BRICS down the bottom are mostly negative. All negative, particularly Mexico. One outstanding example here, though, it appears that China is into positive territory. So it's a net gainer on the transfer of value through the process of trade. And we'll come to explanation of that in a moment. But if you just notice on the other scale, this is the amount of value that they gain net, China does, from having a technical composition of capital, namely its technology is increasingly advanced, rather than whether it gets it from having exploitation of the labor force as such internationally. What we see when Ishikura and Mokre do their work, they show that actually China has been negative for most of this period of time, from 1995 to 2010. So over 15 years of the 25-year period, it was a net loser. It was transferring value to the imperialist bloc as a result of its trading across international markets. However, after 2007 Great Recession, it has moved into becoming a net gainer, according to Ishikara and Mokre. So we have a shift there, and it's entirely due to high investment technology advances, a rising capital composition in China, not due to an extremely increased level of exploitation in the rate of surplus value. So that's you could say that is one argument for suggesting that China might be imperialist on the basis of international value transfers, but it's rather a curious net gain, and only taken place really in the last 15 years according to this data. So leaving the trade for a moment, and let's move to the income that countries get from all their investments that they're making in other countries. The IMF calls this the primary income flows. That's the income from interest, profits, and dividends generated from foreign investment and workers' remittances. Workers send back their money if they're emigrating to other countries, and they remit it back to their original parent company. As a percentage of GDP in 2023, the IMF finds that Netherlands has gross primary income flows of 33% of GDP. That shows how strong the income from interest, profits, and dividends flows through the Netherlands in gross terms. The UK is also high, and you just go down the list here, you can see all the usual suspects that we will call the imperialist countries, right down to Australia. And then when we get to the BRICS, we can see that they're much lower in terms of their gross income they get from interest, profits, and dividends from investments made abroad. China being quite low compared to well within the BRICS range. So if China is an imperialist country, then all the BRICS must be imperialist countries on the basis of this measure. But if we take net flows, so that's the money that's coming from other countries to invest in the country, take that off the gross figures of income flows made from investments abroad, then we get a completely different, well, we get a different look at the thing. So I'd average this over the last 8 years, and you can see that Japan is by far, on this measure, the most imperialist country in the world. It is taking a huge amount of primary flows net after money that's come out of Japan on net basis as a percentage of GDP through international income flows. It's getting 5% of GDP a year. And then we go down the usual suspects of the imperialist countries. They're all positive. Canada, the only one not being in the G7. And then we go into the negative countries, and they're all the usual ones. But China, you can see, is still negative, so it doesn't qualify. These two countries, UK and Netherlands, are negative. And the reason for that is they take a huge amount of investment from abroad, from Saudis, from tax havens and so on, and redistribute it into the rest of the world. They're rentier economies in that sense. So they're running a deficit or a net income flow that's negative because of that situation. But the BRICS as a whole runs a net primary income flow that's negative, and all the BRICS countries are negative as well, including China. So then we can look at global exports, or particularly foreign direct investment, which Lenin was referring to in his points on imperialism. This is the global figure. This is the amount of foreign direct investment taking place every year in dollars billion, flying out of different countries across the world. And you can see that it reached 2 trillion in 2008, and then we have the global slump, and then we have the pandemic slump when it went reduced considerably, but it's around 1.6 trillion a year at the moment. But you can see that it's instead of the continual rise that we saw in the 90s and early 2000s, now we have a stabilization or even a fall. That's an indication of the lack of globalization, it seems to me, the end of globalization. That global FDI outflows are no longer rising. They've been reduced through the process of the breakup of, if you want, American imperialism and its relative strength into more diverse flows, and also reduction in protection and reduction in investment by the big multinationals abroad. Now, if we look at the share of world foreign direct investment, here is the US 1990 to 07, the blue blocks. All those are the blue blocks, 1990 to 07, before the Great Recession began. The US had 20% of all world FDI outflows. That's fallen to 17% now in the last 15 years. The G7 as a whole had 61% now to 41%. If you see why that's 45, that big fall there is because of the UK. The UK has completely dropped as an imperialist FDI exponent across the world. The weakness of the UK economy is showing that in the decline in the share that it's got within the G7. Same with the Eurozone, which has also declined. US has declined a bit. Japan has continued to increase its share compared to the others in the G7. If we look at the rest of the advanced countries, there's hardly much difference. They're still maintaining something like 27 to 29% of world FDI outflows. China has increased its world FDI outflows, as you might expect, from hardly anything at all up to 2007 to nearly 9%. This is the share. The reason the share is increased, of course, is because the shares in the imperialist countries have declined. And the rest of the BRICS has also had an increase in the share. And the rest of the developing economies have also had an increase in share. So the relative decline in imperialism and its ability to export capital has led to an increase in the share of the peripheral countries, in particularly China. But if we look at as a percentage of the country's GDPs, I've just compared the US and China, FDI outflows for the US per year as a percentage of their GDP is around about 1 to 1.5%. It's been gradually declining since the Great Recession. In the case of China, it's been around 0.5%, reaching just over that before, now around about 1%. In fact, the US and China's FDI outflows, the amount that they invest abroad as a percentage of their GDP, is pretty similar in the case of the US and China. I think the main reason for China's growth in FDI outflows is their policy of One Belt, One Road, where we see the expansion of investment by Chinese state companies and others into the rest of the world as a guided program coming from the Communist Party government to expand investment around the world in terms of projects in order to develop the economies of the peripheral economies. If you look at the composition of One Belt, One Road, it's not huge investments in order to make profits from the point of view as the most of the imperialist investments are. It is majority is in construction projects. So the projects are owned. What's produced is owned by the countries in which these construction projects take place. China is merely providing credit and then the resources and skills to produce these constructions. They're not permanent investments by Chinese companies which will then extract profits, at least not the majority of them. So if we look at China's FDI flows, its inward flows, which is the blue line, has gradually declined. So capitalist and imperialist countries that started off investing into China have gradually reduced their FDI inflows as a percentage of Chinese GDP. Of course, Chinese GDP has risen quickly, so of course that obviously reduces the share. While, as we've seen, their outflow is around 0.9. So basically, they're the same. So there's no strong outflow net from China in FDI because they also have inward FDI inflows. So they're pretty much balanced in terms of the percentage of GDP. And if we look at the total accumulated amount of export of capital accumulated over a long period of time, in this case 35 years, we can see that the US had, in the period before the Great Recession, 33% of the world's foreign direct investment stock. That's fallen to 22%. The rest of the advanced economies are broadly the same at around about 60%. China's is increased from virtually nothing to 4%. So it now has 4% or just over of the world's FDI stock. It is still nowhere near the level of FDI stock, legacy stock, if you like, in the US or the rest of the advanced economies, the imperialist bloc. The rest of the BRICS have increased slightly, and so have developed economies since 2007. So if you want to look more closely at that, if that tells you the results of the export of capital over the last 30 years, and you can see that China has increased its world FDI stock. So the export of capital from China has led to an increase in FDI stock, but its share is tiny, still tiny, compared to the 80% plus that the imperialist economies hold in terms of world FDI stock. Finally, I just want to present this question of excess yield. This is a new study by Piketty from the World Inequality Lab. Let me quote: "The richest countries have become the bankers of the world, attracting excess savings by providing low-yield safe assets and investing these inflows in more profitable ventures. Such a privilege is transferred into net income transfers from the poorest to the richest, equivalent to 1% of GDP, for the top 20% of countries and 2% of GDP for the top 10%, the imperialist core, alleviating the current account balance of the latter while deteriorating the bottom 80% by 2 to 3% of their GDP. So in addition to the 1% transfer on trade and primary income flows that we've seen before, they're also getting an increased share of a higher level of yield on the assets they have invested compared to the periphery in the world. In fact, they're losing share the periphery compared to the imperialist world. So if you add it all together again, 3, 4 or 5% of GDP every year is going to the imperialist economies from the poorer countries of the world, and that includes China. So if you look at the average annual excess yield on net foreign assets as a share of country GDP in the last 20 years or so, here it is, the excess yield on net foreign assets. So that's the amount of investment that, say, France has made and how much return they're getting over and above what they have to pay out on people who are investing in their country. And they've got a net yield of 2% of GDP every year or more as through this process of better returns from their assets abroad than people are getting from investing in France, UK, US similarly. The G7 average is high, Canada and so on. But when we get to the periphery, and particularly the BRICS, they're all negative. So China may have investments abroad, but it's the return it gets on its investments are not anywhere near sufficient to cover from the extraction of profits and yield that countries that have invested in China are making and returning to their own countries. And of course, when we get to some of these other BRICS, it's even higher than the 2% China has over that period. So this is a privilege of imperialism. And this is the Piketty graph, which shows that. So you can see the BRICS, which is the dotted line, is negative and has been negative for the last 20 years or more. And in the case of China, which is the yellow line, it's also negative. Russia's even worse. And all the imperialist economies right up there, Japan, as I've seen before, the most successful imperialist economy in terms of returns that it's getting in various ways. And the US remains too, and the dotted line is the Eurozone as a whole. It's a clear example of the sheer difference between the imperialist bloc and the rest of the world as represented by the BRICS, including China. So my conclusion is the imperialist bloc of countries is virtually the same as those advanced capitalist economies that Lenin identified in the imperialist grouping in 1915. It's around 13 or maybe a little bit more countries. There've been no new additions to the club. Emerging capitalist economies in the last centuries have been condemned to domination by the imperialist bloc. This study by the World Inequality Database confirms that conclusion. Over the last 50 years in their survey, the imperialist bloc is unchanged and increasing the extraction of wealth income from the rest. And that includes the likes of China, India, Brazil, and Russia. In that sense, these BRICS countries cannot be considered even sub-imperialist, let alone imperialist. And that includes China.
Thank you, Michael, for the very clear graphs. So, over to oops, there. You're the third one.
Oh, you. Sorry.
Okay. Right. Mike, do you think you can step in because Dic has to
Sure. Okay.
have a break. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So you want me to share my screen, right?
Yeah.
Wait a minute. And
Yes,
you want
this is exactly what I wanted. Yeah, presentation.
this is what you want.
Yeah, see the big screen. Thank you.
It's okay, is it?
It is.
Because I see my next slide, but never mind. If you can't, that's fine.
It is normal for us. Yes.
It's normal. Okay.
Okay. Over to
So
you. Yes.
okay. I want first to say that one should have no illusions about states in which capitalism predominates. although I personally do not include China. The quotations on this slide all come from Engels, his essay on the origin of the family. And in it, he pointed out that capitalism was responsible for remarkable achievements, right, in terms of science, technology, the accumulation of wealth. Yet, he insisted, it has never been anything but the development of the small minority at the expense of the overwhelming majority. And he said, it did so as it set in motion and developed the most sordid instincts and passions of man, the naked greed of shabby individuals, brutal sensuality, sordid avarice, and selfish plunder. And it deployed the most outrageous means, theft, rape, deceit, and treachery. And when I read that, it just so struck me as saying things about the terrible state, of the world in which we at present live. But I'm going to argue that imperialism and colonialism should essentially be seen as the exercise of political, military, and discursive power. And while Michael presented some very important arguments, and while I would agree that economic power does also, right, play a role, I want to emphasize the importance of the political, military, and discursive element of imperialism. I mean, imperialism, I would argue, and colonialism designate processes through which a powerful state conquers and dominates, rules, settles, and exploits subordinate states, territories, and peoples that exist beyond its own boundaries. And to some extent, I agree with the suggestion of Kumar that if one looks, say, at Imperial China, or indeed other civilizations, it might be that a political entity can be an empire ruling over a multiplicity of peoples without pursuing imperialism. So I'm drawing on Pannekoek, who actually pointed out that imperialism resides to a very substantial extent on the exercise of military and political power, but I would also say discursive power. Now, Michael is right that in the Marxist tradition, theories of imperialism emerged and were associated with the idea that capitalism had entered a new monopoly stage. But one of the reasons for the development of this theory of imperialism was that there was also an attempt to address a whole series of acts of aggression, including the Spanish-American War, the Boer War, the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, and so on. And it is also the case that in his imperialism, Lenin pointed out that he couldn't discuss the political dimension because of Tsarist thought control. And had he been able to do so, he would have done so. If one looks outside of Marxism, Max Weber, Joseph Schumpeter, they claim that liberal or competitive capitalism does not require imperialist expansion. And I think they raise an important issue here about the nature of international economic relations. And they raise an important question about the role of imperialism as opposed to the kind of competition, that often occurs between, if you like, market entities or countries, in which market economies have been established. So Weber, thought that imperialism was a potential development within capitalism, but that it was associated with a specific expansionist dynamic of the capitalist state, as well as the economic domination of monopoly interests, the monopoly interests that Lenin emphasized. It's also important to emphasize that the maintenance of political and economic domination of a class, right, led to, as Lenin said, the division of the world into great powers and privileged oppressors and plunderers on the one side and oppressed countries on the other. But as I emphasized, Lenin could not discuss the political dimension because of censorship in the Tsarist Russia. I think it's also important to recognize that basically in this era, and to me, I associate imperialism with the establishment and maintenance of hegemony. And that hegemony rests on coercion, repression, the inculcation of fear, the fear that causes so many countries in West Asia not to challenge the United States. But it also rests on consent, right? Intellectual moral leadership, alliances, and integration. And in this quest, dominant international and transnational social forces, hegemonic powers, they draw on the assistance of international organizations, national agencies with international responsibilities, specialized entities such as intelligence agencies, non-governmental organizations, and so on, all of which intervene in the domestic affairs of other countries and in a sense deny other countries' sovereignty. I just want, to emphasize the importance of these political, military, and discursive dimensions, just to say a few words about imperialism in our era. In the United States, the neoconservative project for a new American century planned regime change in 7 countries in 5 years: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Although many regime change operations succeeded, the main consequences were a trail of death and destruction across West Asia, refugee crises, the bombing of cities such as Belgrade, Baghdad, Tripoli, Gaza, Damascus, Beirut, Tehran, the hegemonic destabilization of many countries, direct and indirect military intervention and regime change in the name of Western democracy, which had disastrous consequences in the shape of chronic states of war and terrorism, trails of death across West Asia, as I said, state collapse, economic ruin, and humanitarian crises. And the consequences for the West were also serious, because what is starting to emerge is an international recognition of double standards, serious reputational damage, a crisis of legitimacy, an erosion of US power. As I said, successive refugee crises, and an acceleration of moves by the global South and East to establish a new non-Western international order. So, I'm emphasizing a particular dimension of the actions of imperial states that I consider to be critically important, alongside the economic dimensions that Michael, analyzed so effectively. But I want to make a second point, and that really concerns differences between societies and civilizations. In a world, of multiple civilizations, in the 15th century, a number of European countries had acquired Chinese inventions, gunpowder, magnetic compass, watertight compartments in ships. And what they did was they put guns on ships and they colonized the world. Now, one can compare what happened subsequently with what happened in East Asia. Essentially, from Greece and Rome onwards, the Western world was almost permanently at war. In the 100 years peace, there was incessant colonial and imperial war. Whereas in East Asia, there were 300 years of peace, right? Between, as I said, 2 Japanese invasions of Korea, into which China was drawn. And in 1598 to 1894, there were only 3 conflicts that involved China. There were 2 conflicts between Siam and Myanmar. China, in many ways, if one sets aside what happened on its northwestern frontiers, was at peace for 500 years. And there was a complete absence of the creation of overseas empires. But I think what one could actually argue is that in East Asia, a polycentric East Asian, say Gongshang is a Chinese concept, symbiosis, system characterized by a set of principles, norms, and codes of conduct relating to interstate relations in which large and small countries found a proper place and which, over the course of millennia fostered voluntary and tribute trade and peaceful coexistence. Of course, it was interrupted, after the Meiji Restoration and the industrialization of Japan. So I'm arguing there are important civilizational differences. In February 2021, the newly appointed Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, gave several speeches and interviews in which he repeated the line, "The world doesn't organize itself." When we're not engaged, when we don't lead, then one of two things happens. Either some other country tries to take our place, but probably not in a way that advances our interests and values, or no one does, and then you get chaos. Now, I would argue that it is not the case that in the absence of a hegemon, chaos prevails. And if you look at Chinese international relations, there is a concept of a harmonious international order centered on the avoidance of conflict through the pursuit of shared interests. And these are rooted, in certain Chinese concepts like tianxia, which is sometimes controversial, relationality, guanxi, symbiosis, gongsheng. In 1972, Mao Zedong took part in a discussion in the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party of China. And Mao updated 3 stratagems that were actually recommended by Zhu Sheng to the first Ming Emperor. The words that Mao used were, dig deep caves, store grain everywhere, and never seek hegemony. So what Mao was doing was drawing on a traditional distinction in China between a king who rules by benevolence and righteousness, Wang Chuanli, and a hegemon who rules by power, Bao Chuan. And he insisted, that China should never seek hegemony, Bu Changba. And Xi Jinping repeatedly says that it never will. And I think this is a very, very profound, difference in thought about the organization of the international system and the relations between states. I'm sorry, this is in Chinese, but basically when Xi Jinping launched this notion of a community of shared destiny for mankind, he asked some questions. He said, what's wrong with our world? And then he went on to ask what we should do. And then he identified a series of deficits, peace, development, governance. And after that, put forward a series of proposals for a global civilization initiative, for a global development initiative, for a global indivisible security initiative, and more recently, for a global governance initiative. So, in a sense, this is a notion of creating a world in which states cooperate with one another, live in peace with one another, solve problems through negotiation. It doesn't necessarily resolve the problems that are associated with the existence of capitalism in certain countries, but it creates a world in which, in a sense, it impedes the kind of imperialist conduct that has had such tragic consequences for our world. I want just to make, a final point, which is that I insisted on the idea that there is this idea that ideas play a role in establishing hegemony of one part of the world over another part of the world. And recently, of course, of the collective West over the rest of the world. And one can make a distinction between the discussion of what one might call common or shared values and what the European Union calls our values, what the collective West claims are universal values. In January 2021, Xi Jinping spoke of the common values of humanity. So in other words, although we have a world of multiple civilizations in which you should respect other civilizations and allow them to make their own choices about their development paths, people in this world do share values such as peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, freedom, maybe equality. But in this case, the word common is consciously used to refer, say, gongyi is to refer to a generic concept. What the Western world does is it replaces or conflates a generic concept, which could be a universal value, with a specific set of institutions, in other words, capitalist institutions, that each seeks to impose on the rest of the world. So what Xi is in a sense saying is that we do share certain values, but the way in which we establish democratic governance, for example, and I would argue that China is in many respects democratic, can differ. Different countries can make different choices. Socialist countries can make different choices. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that it's very hard to conceive of China as imperialist if one thinks of imperialism in the way in which I've just spoken about it. I mean, if I just try to conclude, I would say that colonialism and imperialism involve the use by states and their elites of political, military, economic, and ideological power, and I recognize that monopoly power can also play a role, to establish direct or indirect control over territories beyond their own boundaries, combining them into imperial and sub-imperial spheres of power. And the use of hegemonic destabilization, direct and indirect military intervention, interference in the internal affairs of other countries, colonization, regime change, a whole series of operations designed in order to extend their sphere of influence, and actions which can lead to genocide, war, and inequality. I mean, we've seen the genocide in the last 500 years of the indigenous population of 2 continents, and then the enslavement of many of those who lived in Africa. So China's international engagement is underpinned by a concept of harmony and symbiosis. And the evidence that the aforementioned conduct of China and of other parts of East Asia in countries beyond its boundary is, in fact, set aside Japan after the Meiji Restoration, but is extremely limited. Although China and many parts of Southeast and Southeast Asia were in part, and the global South were major victims of such conduct. And I would argue that in that sense, the claim that China is imperialist is false. It deflects attention from the fundamental problems that bedevil our world. I agree with Michael, development is an issue, but in the absence of an attempt to address many of the other extraordinary problems that we confront, development is something that is impeded. And I think that this charge, that China is an imperial power, actually impedes attempts to address the world's fundamental problems. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, very much for the passionate speech. It's moving, I think. It's something so obvious, but yes, very often being overlooked. Thank you for bringing that up. So over to Dic now, our last presenter. After that, then we will have a discussion. So,
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me clearly. Right. So what I want to do is to give a presentation by the title, A Critique of Western-centric Views on Imperialism and China. Now, of course, this in a sense is somewhat idiosyncratic because of the term Western-centric views, which I will try to give a kind of definition of the right. Let me put it this way: that it is discernible that the Western-centric views on imperialism and China actually have a long traditions first in historiography. But what is new in recent years is the invoking Marxist vocabulary to reinterpret or further extend this tradition. So by Western-centric, I mean the action, the acts or the initiative of ignoring, discounting, or denying imperialism as let me try to as historically the specific, while at the same time pervasively existing system in the modern world, that is a system centering on the hitherto unrivaled hegemony of the capitalist core of the world. So this is my starting point, which is debatable, but let's for the moment take this as given, and then let's see how far we can go in moving along this direction. Now, then we can see that the claim that China has always embodied elements of imperialism dating back to at least the near pre-modern epoch. This has persisted in Western historiography for a long time. And then there is the further claim, which I mentioned is what I call the Western-centric left, right? That they claim that today China is approaching the point of fully fledged imperialism, defined according to Marxist theory of imperialism as the actual form of capitalism in history. That whether it is the highest stage or otherwise is again a matter of the controversy, but at least Marxist theory of imperialism is a theory of capitalism. So what I want to do is to attempt to articulate a counter-argument that these Western-centric views both misinterpret China and mislead the understanding of the world we are actually living in. Now, the first, that this, in a sense, is just the background, like the history writing in the Western tradition, that in that literature, there are two long-lasting arguments on China and imperialism, given the fact that is universally recognized that China has a history of encounter with the West since the time of the Opium War. In the Chinese society, this is commonly is almost universally understood as China's encounter with imperialism and quite miserable or disastrous experience. So in response to such almost consensus in the Chinese society, Western scholars, historians try to make two arguments in defense of the West, in relation to interpreting this encounter. The first argument is that China has also been imperialist anyway. So that's that we need not blame the West for being imperialist because China too has also been imperialist. Then the claim that China as an empire embodying conquest and settlerist colonialism in the near pre-modern epoch, and some core element of this have persisted all the way until today. So this argument, of course, mostly follows the non-Marxist theories of imperialism, whereby imperialism is claimed to be no more than pre-modern remnants, and it will wither away along with capitalist modernization. So this is the first argument. The second argument, also from history writing, is the argument of high-level equilibrium trap, that imperialism actually has been beneficial for China, despite the painful process of the encounter. It's necessary for China to be able to embark on the path of modernization. Now, of course, in the Marxist tradition, this is also a widely held view, best known with the work of Bill Wallace, the claim that imperialism is the pioneer of capitalism. Wallace referring to the case of India, that the colonization of India was necessary for India to embark on the path of modernization. So very much I hate to say, but many people claim that this is the theory of the New Left Review, the Wallens, Brenner, and so on. Now, what is of great interest to me or a challenge to me is what I call the newly or recently emerged Western-centric left views somehow preserve the core elements of these two arguments with some modifications for assessing the reality to date. So the first argument has been invoked for accusing China today on questions Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, South China Sea, and incidentally, I've seen many Korean, Vietnamese left-wing scholars claiming that China had colonized them for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So, and China has today preserved such a kind of inclination. So anti-imperialism also meaning anti-China from the point of view of Korean, Vietnamese, or even Japanese left-wing scholars, Japanese Trotskyists or Japanese Communist Party have such views. Now, so that irrespective of the sufficient or otherwise of empirical knowledge, which I would claim that they have very little knowledge anyway. But that the important point is that the accusation ultimately falls back on the supposedly universal truth of the principle of national self-determination because of the difficulty with the identification of the nation. So ultimately it falls back on the in practice, like the local self-determination. Now, in other events, I've argued that upholding such a universal truth is an outright blasphemy of historical justice and covers up the facts that we are living in an interstate system reigned by Western hegemony. So much so that we see what happened. The left in Taiwan, they welcome Japanese colonization far more than they prefer Japanese colonization than the Taiwan being part of China. That's the latest move. But anyway, what is the important is the position about the second argument, that leaving aside what imperialism actually did to China in history. Now, the main point today is that China is being accused of exploiting the rest of the non-Western world, and therefore it is imperialism, or some people like to call it imperialism in the process of formation. Now, so let's stick to mainly the second argument about the Marxist tradition of interpreting imperialism as the manifestation of capitalism. So that concerns the material foundation of materiality of imperialism rather than treating it as something the remnants of the pre-modern world. So imperialism is capitalist in nature, driven by the logic of systemic capital accumulation. So in this light, imperialism can be seen as the spatial extension of the system of capitalism emanating from the global north, that is the capitalist core, starting with Western Europe, plus North America and Japan later on, and progressively incorporating every society of the remaining world, which conveniently we call the global south, into its remit. So the modern world is under what Marx called the world history. The modern, it has the world history, unlike the pre-modern. And this can be interpreted as the conquest of the world by imperialism. So therefore, talking about the material condition or foundation, it is the northern capital exploiting southern labor. That is imperialism. So it could take different forms: outright plundering, forgery, plus seemingly free trade investment and underpinned by military, political, ideological hegemony, and financial and technological monopolies. So the two sides of the same process of imperialism, that is labor, free or unfree, it could be unfree labor, like plantation economy, or in the China before 1949, the recreation of semi-slavery labor with the investment by Japanese and British companies, the investments in Shanghai and surrounding area, recreating semi-slavery labor. Anyway, free or unfree labor, they create surplus. And surplus fits that it could be capitalist in the production process, therefore surplus value, but it need not be. The point is that it's surplus fitting the systemic capital accumulation. So surplus transfer is part of the broader process of the polarizing development between the North and the South. And this is particularly the theory of Latin American dependency theory, making 2 points. One point is the surplus transfer giving the advantage of reinforcing the advantage to the North in capital accumulation, and therefore technological and financial monopolies. But furthermore, and more importantly, the asymmetry between the two sides of the polarizing development, in the sense that at the time of prosperity or peaceful time, it's the unequal distribution of surplus. At the time of crisis, there's a asymmetry that the global North bears the brunt of the crisis, but far more so than the North. For example, at the time of the outbreak of the 2008 financial crisis in New York, immediately at least 20 million Chinese workers were threatened to lose their jobs. That's according to the Chinese Prime Minister. So this second point has quite often been overlooked, that capitalism is embodied with intrinsic tendency to run into crisis from time to time, and the global South tends to bear the brunt. Now, further to the above, there are additional, more concrete theories about the working of imperialism, and one very fashionable theory that has been used by what I call the Western-centric labs over the past decade or so, is to focus on the Luxembourg type underconsumption theories as the main theory of imperialism. And of course, it fits well to the political correctiveness of social democratism, that accusing China of exporting excess capacity, causing global imbalances, of taking up too much of the demand of the world, etc. Right. Now, these theories might or might not have elements of truth. They could be true in different circumstances, but this, at any rate, cannot be general theories of imperialism. Right. So the reason is that because a low or a fall in the consumption rates might, but need not lead to demand falling short of supplies, and therefore profitability decline, and therefore leading to crisis of over-accumulation. So it could be, but it need not be. Now, so because in principle, that there is at least the possibility that investment making up for consumption as a source of demand by means of creating incomes. So again, a quick note that the insufficient of demand in the world economy in the era of globalization might well be the results of capitalists being reluctant to invest, rather than China underconsumption in China. That is I think that's important point to note, because outside China we have seen the stagnation in investment in the advanced countries and then also in the developing world for fully the more than 4 decades, insufficiency of investment rather than underconsumption. Now, Lenin type theories of imperialism as monopoly capitalism could also be seen as history specific at another level. The strive to capture super profits might well be based on monopoly and capital exports, but the reverse deduction need not hold. That is to say, monopoly and capital exports need not strive for capturing super profits. Now, this is in a sense, an antithesis of Lenin, but it might not be true in the time of Lenin, but it might well be true, as we'll see in a moment, in nowadays, in the time of China, of the influence of China on the world economy. Now, Lenin and contemporaries, the urgent concern was the war and revolution of that time. And this, once again, results in the history specificity of the theories of imperialism, that we always need to recall that imperialism is about capital-labor confrontation on the world scales. So whether inter-imperial rivalry would emerge or not from the systemic capital accumulation is a secondary questions. So the importance of revolution within imperialist nations depends on the broader context, that is the interaction between actually two pairs of struggles, national labor versus national capital and southern labor versus northern capitals. But actually, again, this is very much a long-lasting debate. I would like to refer you to first the debate over the Giovanni Arrighi's, the Adam Smith in Beijing, and then about 10 years later, recently, the debate over Domenico Rossado's book, Western Marxism. Both are closely related to this important point about how do we understand capitalism and therefore imperialism of our times. Now, seen from the perspective of the population of the world as a whole, imperialism, the foremost important question is always the question about development of underdevelopment. That is capital striving to pursue super profits by means of extracting the surplus from southern labor. So international conflicts of all kinds nowadays ought to be assessed in relation to this issue, ignoring, discounting, or denying the centrality of this issue is Western-centric, because this is to cover up the hegemony of the capitalist core in the world from the beginning of the modern all the way until today. So, and by extension, therefore, the politics of imperialism cannot be separated from the economics of imperialism. There is no such thing as inter-imperial rivalry if pursuing super profits via surplus transfer from the global south does not characterize one or both of the two parties involved. So nor can the pursuit of super profits this way be successful without the politics of imperialism. That is why we call American imperialism is, in a sense, a continuation of British imperialism, despite the fact that outright colonial conquests have gone. Now, the final bit, very quickly, based on the conceptual discussion above, we have a quick look at China onto the stage of the theories of imperialism, of the application of the theories. Provided that they could be made hostile to China, they have been picked up by the Western-centric left of various persuasions. One, of course, is simple labeling. Call it imperialist, then everyone can hate call it China. So And of course, following the mimicking the Western-centric views in history writing is critical in appearance, but ultimately is apologetic, as I mentioned, because the elephant in the room, the hegemony of the West, being covered up. Now, and then invoking Luxemburg type theory of underconsumption is fashionable nowadays, but actually it's only served to comfort all the major political forces in the West, and rather than being enlightening for understanding the real world. And then applying Lenin's 5 criteria of imperialism, which Michael Roberts' presentation have already listed out, but with no qualification about their history specificities, is no more than fundamentalist and therefore dogmatic actions. So ultimately, what is absolutely necessary for assessing China in the lens of imperialism is hard evidence of systemic surplus transfer from the rest of the world to China, whether this has or has not happened. And I think Michael has already demonstrated that existing scholarship provides no evidence of this kind. Systemic surplus transfer to China does not appear to be in existence. That is rather the opposite of China's transfer of surplus to the outside world. In so far as we isolate the investigation looking at the relationship between China and the global South, there could be the pieces of evidence of the surplus transfer from global South to China in more recent years, but whether these are systemic is again a big question awaiting investigation. Now, in the circumstances where China forms the capability of exporting high-tech products, these are not at all signs of building up monopolies in the world economy, right? Because it's almost always true that Chinese high-tech products have resulted in what is known as cabbage pricing phenomenon. Think of the electric car from China, with the high level of tariffs, still is the selling price is almost a half of the European car. Precisely the same model, right? Volkswagen ID3, ID4 made in Shanghai is much cheaper than Volkswagen made in Germany. So much so that the dealer of Volkswagen wanted to import from Shanghai rather than to sell the same car produced by Volkswagen in Germany. So, and the same for all kinds of machinery, electronics, and so on. So this actually served to undermine the monopoly rents enjoyed by Western corporations rather than anything to build up Chinese monopolies. Now, in the circumstance where China invests in building up productive capacities in the rest of the global South, could they be seen as China exporting excess capacity? That is very much doubtful, right? Because at least we need to first, at the conceptual level, consider the possibility of the investment China for mainly productive investment rather than speculative activities. Therefore, productive investment for the promotion of creating value, therefore income, therefore demands. And most importantly, it is clearly observable that since the turn of the century, from the time of the takeoff of China's economic relationship with the global South all the way up until now, China has been in most years running trade deficits with the rest of the global South rather than the opposites. Okay, so much about the economics of imperialism or the Marxist theories of imperialism, whereby economics and politics are part and parcel of the same unity. But then just a final words about the purely political the theory of imperialism. Of course, not Marxist, but many Western-centric left like to pick this up, but because of political correctness. Now, what I would like to say is that most people do not have the necessary historical and empirical knowledge of what's actually going on, or they have suffered from what I call the selection bias, picking up the evidence that could justify their claims. But there are cases that would not allow for would not let go easily such actions. But say consider the cases of Hong Kong and Taiwan. That's unlike what happened in Xinjiang or Tibet, whereby the reality remains a matter of controversy with different sources of information. In the case of Hong Kong and Taiwan, information is clearly or easily available. Now, it's simple to say that unless people like to uphold the principle of local self-determination as an absolute and universal truth, irrespective of what happened to history, to justice, then can you call all kinds of movements simply pre-capitalistic local sovereignism pertaining to capitalistic Western hegemony? Could this be justified at any rate for those self-labeled left? Thank you.
Thank you, Dic, for a very rich presentation. Sorry, we are quite running out of time, but we will open the floor to anyone who wants to give comments. We may not have time to respond to you, but if you want to share your views, please do so. We have a mic here, yes.
Thank you. I should say, if the APP people, if that the APP is here to basically listen to all these presentations, they would be very happy to introduce their opinions and research. So I think while thinking about the Chinese case, we also careful about such implications for the reproduction of authoritarianism of the Chinese case with regard to world capital. I mean, I'm quite critical about the NATO, particularly defining Taiwan and Hong Kong as local terrorism. It's too much of a criticism for me. I think we need to, as Marxists, we need to talk and discuss more about democracy, socialist democracy, as well as maybe liberal democracy. We should understand their historical development. I mean, these are the close arguments about criticizing, the way you criticize Western countries for imperialism. Just to come to conclusion, like if you're talking about world capitalism, okay, then what sort of maybe points, criteria do we have in our hands to be hopeful about Chinese so-called socialism, okay? So if you're talking about the world capitalism, then why are we not thinking about the Chinese Communist Party as a state to reproduce itself within the conditions of world capitalism, okay? I think be hopeful about the Chinese case. We need to hear more about how, not simply about how Chinese state defends against Western imperialism, which is so clear to everyone here, I guess. So I would agree in agreement with all those criticisms about Western imperialism. But when it comes to being hopeful about Chinese communism, we need to hear maybe or communal capitalism. We need to hear maybe more about how China, for instance, or the Chinese state, endeavor to create a much mature proletariat, which would even maybe limit the Chinese Communist Party. Okay? So, I mean, just talking about interstate rivalry doesn't tell me a lot about Chinese being non-capitalist or maybe being hopeful about the future of Chinese sort of challenge to Western imperialism. So I have indeed two questions to both Peter Dunford and Michael Roberts. I mean, Dunford, that's basically Professor Dunford, that's basically a question because I have the impression that the Chinese Communist Party, rests on or makes references more to Confucius somehow. I think deeply in legitimizing their policy. I might be mistaken, but just a question basically to you. The other Michael Roberts, I'm very happy and very important. I have a lot of information about all these graphics, but why don't you consider China as capitalist? Is it simply a question of quantity or quality? I mean, why not, defining China as a, yes, not developed or less developed capitalist country in comparison to others? I mean, okay, that's a question to see.
Okay, do we, yes, please pass the mic then. Can you hear that? Mike, did you hear that?
No, I can't.
Okay.
It's not very clear.
Okay, sorry. The
But
mic-
continue. You continue. Just leave me.
Yes.
Just leave.
Just yes. Okay, we have another speaker. Yeah, if you come over here. Maybe use this one. Maybe use this one. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Leonardo, and I appreciate this panel because the title of this panel is really important. Why China is not imperialist. And I was listening to the previous presenter, and I think there's a lot of issues really interesting to think about. One, for example, is the definition of Lenin about imperialism, which is based on capital export. And many Marxists today applies this definition in China ascension. China is exporting capital, so China is imperialist. But there is at least two characteristics that is really different. And I'd like to hear about the presenters. The first one is the conditionalities of this capital export. As far as I'm concerned, there's no conditionalities that China imposes on the countries which receive Chinese capital. And I say this based on, especially in the case of Venezuela, which I'm studying right now. And the other issue is that this capital export is commanded by the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, there are private companies, but they are commanded by the Chinese Communist Party. So these two characteristics of capital export from China is totally different from those previously as Lenin studied in Rosa Luxemburgo, etc. So I'd like to hear a bit more about this because these two things seems to be central to understand the nature of Chinese capital export. Do you agree with this? Do you have other comments? Thank you.
Okay, anyone else want to come forward? Yes, please. We need to really stop maybe in maximum 5 minutes because they have the 8 p.m. session on Palestine. So just What's your question?
Thank you. My name is Sofia Manzano. I will present about money as an imperialist weapon. Then I would like to know, I won't debate whether China is capitalist or socialist. I will accept the definition of one country, two system. But I'm concerned about the possible replacement of the dollar as an international currency. And what the role of the new development bank in this case? Because in my concern, in my opinion, the dollar is one of the most important instruments of the imperialism. Okay.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, yeah. Our last speaker from the floor, and responses.
Good afternoon. My name is Aswak, and I'm a student here at the Middle East Technical University. So I don't know if you know Patrick Bond. He says, he wrote a book, and he says, basically countries like China, they talk left and walk right. And he says, they're just playing the long game, they're sub-imperials. So he gives examples like, look at how they prop up regimes in Zimbabwe. They maintain the authoritarianism in Zimbabwe in exchange for cheaper diamonds. And they're also giving debts in the future. They can use it to trap countries. And also they're exploiting workers in African countries, such as Zimbabwe, like I mentioned, Namibia. They fire labor unions and trade unions in those countries. So don't you think it's good enough reason to say China is not an imperial country yet, but it's a sub-imperial country? That's my question.
Right. I don't think we have time for further questions, but from our speakers, do we want to respond quickly to anything? If you can pick up from what's the speaking here. Maybe we start from Dic and then to Michael and then to Meg.
I think that's the quick point. Actually, that's also in relation to what Michael Roberts have presented, that concerning surplus transfer or value transfer. Then I think we might need to move on to more to investigate the nature of surplus transfer. That to put this way, imperialism or capitalism or market economy, these three things have been differentiated in the debates over the Riggy's work on Adam Smith in Beijing, the relationship between China and the rest of the world. And in all three levels, it is possible to have surplus transfer, but it needs one level, say surplus transfer at the level of a market economy need not be the same thing as surplus transfer at the level of the imperialism. And this immediately is related to the first question that has been just asked, right? That what is the nature of China's challenge to the existing world capitalist system? Now, I haven't talked about that, and I don't think, or we haven't talked about this in all the presentations. But implicitly or presumably that China is no longer promoting revolution, not exporting revolution anymore, right? So that it might serve as a player in the existing world economy with the nature as a market participant or possibly as a member of the capitalist world economy, or even possibly as one of the imperialist powers. Conceptually, there are three different possibilities. And the reality it's likely that it is the either capitalists or participants in the world market economy. That is, you can see China's capital exports, therefore creating, at least in different circumstances, capital-labor relationship, capital from China, labor from the global south. This need not be imperialist, but it's still capitalist relationship. Therefore, the term exploitation still can be used, but it need not be in pursuit of super profits based on whatever kind of monopolies, hegemony, etc. That's the imperialism, right? So this is the quick point, and also in relation to the another point that another question, like that China's the various examples being used about China's investment, Chinese capital cheating, say Namibian or Angola, their workers, and these are the micro cases that might be important, but need not be of the representative of the overall the scale of China's presence in the global south. Now, the one point to note is that up until now, the stock of capital, Chinese capital in the global south is mainly the state-owned. Right? I think 5 years ago, about 90% of the capital stock being from state agents. That's different from the private Chinese capital investing.
Sorry, we need to cut you off because we need to give time to Mike and Michael. Mike, quickly.
Okay, very quickly. I mean, I think in relation to these economic issues, I think one should ask oneself, in a world of socialist countries, would these countries trade with one another? Would they invest in one another? Would they transfer knowledge, technology, skills from one to another? So this is important, you know. Second question, if one looks at the huge disparities in our world, it's got a great deal to do with the absence of the diffusion of knowledge, technology, resources. I mean, Sam, you talked about this idea of primitive socialist accumulation. I mean, countries in the global south need investment resources in order to develop social infrastructure, in order to develop other types of infrastructure, in order to establish areas in which they can produce things that meet real needs of the people who live in these countries. So, you know, and I think, in relation to Zimbabwe, I mean, China's view is that Zimbabwe's political issues are issues for the people of Zimbabwe to resolve. You know, they're not going to intervene in that way, but they do cooperate with other countries. I mean, they cooperate with many other countries. And I think, other countries, if they're going to develop, China itself, it needed resources from outside. The first thing it did, after Nixon's visit, was it started to take out international loans. Although it avoided indebtedness, the indebtedness which has trapped so many parts of the global south. So I think one needs to think about it, the possibility of having mutually beneficial economic relationships between countries. I mean, and I think that is, in a sense, what China is seeking to embark on. But I do think you should never forget, that imperialism is about the attempt to establish political, military, and other types of control over other countries in order to distort the field, in order to advance your own particular interests. So you've only got to look at Britain and India, It controls the Indian textile industry as long as the Indian textile industry is more competitive. When Britain is more competitive, it imposes free trade. And then the minute, India becomes competitive in manufactured cottons, it starts to impose new restrictions. This is the exercise of imperialism in order to control and impede the development of other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Yeah, well, quickly then, my presentation presented the quantity. It showed the data. And the data pretty clearly shows that by any definition of the economics of imperialism, China is not imperialist. It is not a major gainer from international trade value transfer. It doesn't gain from primary credit income flows. It doesn't gain from excess yield on the profit of the assets which it controls compared to other things. So on the quantity level, I don't think the argument can be made that China is imperialist. On the contrary, the argument can be made clearly that China is not imperialist on those definitions. Now, the questions have raised the quality of the capital investment that China does make or the trade that it makes. For example, the first question one of the questions raised the point that the conditionalities that the Chinese put forward on this is pretty limited. Their conditionalities are nothing like the conditionalities represented by the hedge funds, the banks, the multinationals, and the international agencies like the IMF and the World Bank present upon countries and companies and people who own resources in the peripheral world in order to get their investment. They are much more draconian than anything China's offered. All the examples that supposedly China has caused problems with turn out when they look at more closely at the studies of what's happened, it's not the case. And I would make the point on quantity again, that 2/3 of China's capital exports is for construction and infrastructure projects controlled in the end and owned by the host countries. They are not investments of companies that China sets up and then transfers profits and interest back to China. So there's a difference in the nature and the quality of that. I don't think China is, the point was made that the dollar is a key imperialist factor in the world. The US dollar, it represents the key factor for US imperialism on the money level. That doesn't apply to China. The renminbi has no role internationally that is of any importance. And in my view, it's not likely to have until imperialism is defeated. The position of the dollar remains dominant, and that demonstrates also the position of the dominance, if relative decline, of US imperialism and the weakness of the alternatives currencies which are offered around the world as an alternative to that. That's what raised certain examples in Africa, which he got from Patrick, who I know well. You can present these arguments, but on the whole, this is a tiny, tiny aspect compared to what, as Mick Dunford has just pointed out, is the major role which is played by imperialism around the world in exploiting the world's population and its labor force. So I don't think any of the arguments or questions raised from the floor change the general conclusion that China is not an imperialist economy.
Thank you very much, Michael and Beck, and Beck again for your excellent presentations and responses. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time for discussion, but I will upload our slides onto the website. And if you have any specific comments or questions to any of us, please write to us. And again, thank you for your participation, and look forward to seeing you at the China panels in the forthcoming days. Thank you. Hi, guys. Thank you very much.